Well, two Republican senators making the first criminal referral to the Justice Department concerning the author of the Trump dossier. Senators Charles Grassley, Lindsey Graham now urging the DOJ to investigate possible criminal charges against the man on the right, Christopher Steele, you know, the former British intelligence officer, who apparently sought to expose Russian interference in our election, and the allegations about then candidate Trump and Moscow in that dossier, which have largely not been verified. So what does all this mean? Judy Miller is here, adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and Fox News contributor. Judy, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Man, oh man, what is this about? Did Christopher Steele lie? And they obviously have to have something to make this referral.
Well, they have to have some reason to make the referral, but the Democrats on this committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, are absolutely convinced that this is a partisan move and that it is part of a broader effort to deflect attention from the investigation into Mr. Trump and his campaign officials and possible collusion with the Russians. Now, this is very unusual because I think Lindsey Graham, especially, who was so critical of President Trump before he was elected and immediately afterwards, has now switched sides and gone over to the pro-Trump people.
Well, can you say that in the fact that they wouldn't make this out of whole cloth? I mean, they would have to have something.
They would have
think, because it is classified. Let me point out, it is classified. The letter is only like one paragraph referring it to the DOJ, and we don't know what's in it because it's classified. And you certainly would not think that both senators would be putting their veracity and their experience and their responsibility and their credibility on the line for something that's all smoke.
Well, let's put it this way. Christopher Steele, a former MI6 spy and among the most respected Russia analysts for the British, was working with the FBI, voluntarily went to the FBI because he was so disturbed by what he was finding and to his inquiry into the possible connections between Donald Trump and the Russians, that he went not only to Senator John McCain, but also himself to the FBI to cooperate with them. Now, if the FBI, which has been working with him for a long time, had reason to believe that he was lying to them, do you think they wouldn't have already opened an investigation into him already?
How do we know there isn't one?
We don't.
This is not part of what Mueller is.
We don't know, and we don't know whether or not Mueller has been focused on Christopher Steele. But what we do know, in addition to the fact that some of his, in fact, many of his allegations have not yet been verified or substantiated, we don't know the state of the investigation. We don't know the extent to which Christopher Steele's charges figured into the launching of this whole investigation. But Mr. Clapper, who a former intelligence agency chief, and others have said, that's not how this thing started.
Yeah, they're now saying Papadopoulos got drunk.
That's right.
In the bar in London with the Australian diplomat and spilled all these beans about this.
And that was a New York Times story in December that corrected the record.
But, I mean, look, the dossier is not something that's under oath, right? And if Christopher Steele is talking with the FBI agents, they would write out, I guess, a 302 or something about it. But they wouldn't, that's not under oath.
Exactly.
So how could you potentially bring charges against him if he said, let's say if he said, did you share this with anybody else? He goes, no, yet he was giving it to reporters at the same time.
Well, there could be a possible conflict between what Mr. Steele told the FBI and what he has said in a civil case that's being played out in the London courts. We just don't know. What we do know is that Christopher Steele himself has not spoken to any of the three committees in the House and Senate that are investigating. You know what disturbs me, Eric, is that we have an election coming up, and the whole point of this inquiry and these investigations was supposed to be aimed at finding out whether or not Russia actively subverted our democracy. And it seems to me that people have just lost track of what the underlying issue is. And we have a very important election coming up in 2018. And you would think that the Republicans and the Democrats on that committee and on other committees would want to get to the bottom of that issue rather than go after an individual who may or may not have been truthful with the FBI.
Well, if he wasn't truthful with the FBI, I mean, he certainly should be held and accountable to the law and the rule of law.
Yes, but that's I think, in my view, of lesser priority than finding out what the Russians did, whether or not they were successful, whether or not there was anyone beyond the people who have already been charged in this investigation who are surrounded by surrounding Mr. Trump who were connected to the Russians. That's the really key issue here, and we've all lost
And one would assume that that's exactly what Mueller is now trying to do, but you raise a much broader issue with the midterms coming up. I mean, in Riverside County, California, because I cover this for Fox News, election integrity, someone went in and tinkered with the voter registrations and changed some of them, and they don't know who it was. They didn't have the record of that. And it's just been passed on through. The DA dealt with it, but there have been no charges because they can't figure out who fiddled with the registrations.
That's right. And these issues are so important. And they're going to be important in 2018, where a simple 2-vote shift in the Senate could actually change who controls the Senate, from the Republicans to the Democrats, if they win. So we've got to understand what the Russians did, whether or not there was anyone in the Trump campaign beyond Mr. Manafort, who was talking to the Russians, his former campaign advisor, and the other people who have already been charged, who had any connections with the Russians, and especially whether or not they colluded to undermine our democracy. And that's the issue here.
That is. Right now, there hasn't been any charge of collusion. No. Or it's not a crime or a conspiracy, although the Manafort case, as well as Rick Gates' financial dealings and potential lying, allegedly, to federal prosecutors and to the FBI. And we'll see what happens with Christopher Steele if this gets any traction.
Absolutely.
Judy, thank you, as always.
Thank you, Eric.
Of course.